I knew something was wrong the moment I smelled rotten eggs in my brand new living room. My wife had passed away 2 years earlier, and buying this house in Meadowbrook Estates, just outside Bakersfield, California, was supposed to be my fresh start. Instead, I was standing in what should have been my dream home, gagging on the stench of what the realtor had cheerfully dismissed as new construction smell. My name is Zachary Owens, and I had paid $375,000 for a 3-bedroom ranch-style house in a development that promised modern living with small-town charm. The HOA fees were steep at $250 a month, but the developer's brochure showed pristine streets, a community pool, and perfectly manicured lawns. What they didn't show was that we were all living on top of a ticking time bomb. The smell hit me hardest in the mornings. I would wake up at 6, stumble to the kitchen to make coffee, and immediately feel nauseous. At first, I thought maybe there was a problem with my plumbing. I called a plumber who charged me $200 to tell me my pipes were fine. Then I thought maybe something had died in the walls. An exterminator charged me $300 to confirm there were no dead animals anywhere in the house. It was my neighbor, a retired schoolteacher named Martha, who first mentioned the methane. She lived 3 houses down and had been complaining about headaches and dizziness since she moved in 6 months before me. "I'm telling you, Zachary, something isn't right with this neighborhood," she said one evening as we both checked our mailboxes. "My grandson is an environmental scientist, and he says the symptoms I'm describing sound like gas exposure." I didn't want to believe her. I had sunk my entire savings into this house. But 2 weeks later, when I came home from work at the county assessor's office to find my basement filled with a visible haze, and the smell so strong I could taste it, I knew I couldn't ignore it anymore. I called the gas company immediately. The technician who showed up was a young guy named Eddie, probably in his mid-20s, with the kind of perpetual tan you get from working outdoors in California. He took one whiff inside my house, and his expression changed from casual to concerned in seconds. "Sir, I need you to step outside right now," he said, already pulling out some kind of detector from his toolkit. We stood on my front lawn while he went through the house with his equipment. When he came back out 15 minutes later, his face was pale despite the tan. "Mr. Owens, you've got methane levels in your basement that are off the charts. I'm talking concentrations high enough to be explosive. I have to report this immediately." My stomach dropped. "Explosive? How is that possible? This house is brand new." Eddie shook his head. "It's not coming from inside your house, sir. It's coming from underground. The gas is seeping up through your foundation." The gas company red tagged my house that same day, which meant I legally couldn't stay there until the problem was resolved. I ended up in a motel on the outskirts of Bakersfield, paying $89 a night while still making my mortgage payments. I was furious, confused, and desperate for answers. That's when I got my first interaction with Brenda Patterson, the president of the Meadowbrook Estates Homeowners Association. I had barely heard from the HOA since moving in, aside from a welcome letter and monthly reminders about keeping my lawn trimmed to exactly 2.5 inches. But the day after the gas company condemned my house, Brenda showed up at the motel. She was exactly what you would expect from an HOA president. Mid-50s, highlighted blonde hair cut in an aggressive bob, wearing a pastel pink blazer despite the 90-degree heat. She had that smile that didn't reach her eyes, the kind that said she was about to make your life difficult while pretending to help. "Mr. Owens, I heard about your little gas situation," she said, settling into the uncomfortable chair across from my motel bed without being invited. I wanted to come discuss this with you personally before things got out of hand. Little gas situation, I repeated, incredulous. Brenda, my house is a potential bomb. The gas company says I can't live there. She waved her hand dismissively, her acrylic nails catching the light. These things always sound worse than they are. I'm sure it's just an isolated issue with your specific lot. Maybe some underground pocket of natural gas. It happens sometimes. The technician said the methane is seeping through my foundation. That suggests it's coming from a larger source. Brenda's smile tightened. Well, we certainly can't have you spreading panic throughout the community. The HOA has worked very hard to maintain property values here. Wild speculation about gas problems could cause a lot of unnecessary concern. I stared at her. Unnecessary concern. My house could explode. Which is your problem to solve, Mr. Owens. I suggest you contact the builder about your foundation. But I need you to understand that if you start making accusations or frightening other residents, the HOA will have no choice but to take action. We have provisions in our bylaws about residents who damage the community's reputation. She left before I could fully process what she had just threatened me with. I sat in that motel room, looking at the peeling wallpaper and water-stained ceiling, and realized I was in way over my head. Over the next week, I started doing research. I pulled up every document I could find about Meadowbrook Estates, including the original land surveys and property records. What I found made my blood run cold. The 45-acre plot where our neighborhood sat had been a municipal landfill from 1962 until 1989. The county had closed it down and supposedly remediated the site in the early 90s, but the records were vague about what that remediation actually involved. I took my findings to Martha, who immediately called her grandson, Daniel. He drove up from Los Angeles the next day, a serious-looking man in his 30s with a PhD in environmental engineering from UCLA. He listened to everything I had to say, reviewed the documents I had found, and then did something I hadn't expected. He pulled out his own methane detector. "These are cheap now," he explained as we walked through the neighborhood. "A couple $100 online. Every house near a former landfill should have one." We tested the air around my property first. The readings were alarming. Then we walked to Martha's house. Same results. Then to the house next door to hers, where a young family with 2 small children had just moved in 3 weeks earlier. The readings there were even worse. Daniel stood in the middle of the street, looking at his device, and said quietly, "This entire neighborhood is sitting on an active landfill. The methane is everywhere. This is a disaster waiting to happen." "How is that legal?" I asked. "How could a developer build houses on top of a landfill?" "It's not illegal if the proper remediation was done," Daniel explained. "But from these readings, either the remediation was inadequate or it's failing. Probably both. Landfills can produce methane for decades, even centuries. You need proper ventilation systems, gas collection infrastructure, monitoring wells. Did any of your home inspections mention anything like that?" I thought back to my home inspection, conducted by a cheerful man recommended by my realtor. He had checked the roof, the foundation, the electrical system, and given everything a clean bill of health. There had been no mention of any special systems for gas ventilation, no mention of the property's history as a landfill. Nothing. The next morning, I contacted a lawyer. His name was Howard Brennan, and he specialized in real estate fraud and environmental law. His office was in a strip mall in Bakersfield, wedged between a nail salon and a tax preparation service, but his credentials were solid. He listened to my story, reviewed the documents I had brought, and leaned back in his chair with a low whistle. "Mr. Owens, If what you're telling me is accurate, this is one of the biggest cases of development fraud I've seen in my 20-year career, he said. Building on a former landfill isn't automatically illegal, but there are strict regulations. The developer had to disclose the site's history to buyers. They had to ensure proper remediation and ongoing monitoring. And most importantly, they absolutely cannot build residential properties on an active landfill, which is what you're describing. So what do I do? First, we need independent testing, professional grade. I know an environmental consulting firm that does this kind of work. They're not cheap, but we need documentation that will hold up in court. Second, we need to find out what the developer knew and when they knew it. Third, we need to talk to the other residents. If this is affecting the whole neighborhood, we need to organize. The environmental testing cost $5,000, which I barely had after the motel expenses and lawyer consultations. But the results were damning. The consulting firm spent 3 days testing soil samples, air quality, and methane concentrations throughout Meadowbrook Estates. Their report confirmed everything Daniel had suspected. The landfill beneath our homes was still actively producing methane. Concentrations in some areas were high enough to pose explosion risks. The report also noted that there were no functioning gas ventilation systems anywhere in the development, despite county regulations requiring them for any construction on former landfill sites. Armed with this report, Howard scheduled a meeting with all the residents of Meadowbrook Estates. We held it at the community center, the same building where the HOA held its monthly meetings. 43 of the 45 homeowners showed up. The only ones who didn't were a couple on vacation in Hawaii. I stood in front of my neighbors and told them everything. Some people were shocked. Others were angry. A few were in denial, but everyone was scared. These weren't wealthy people. Most of us had stretched ourselves financially to afford these homes. The idea that our biggest investments were not just worthless but potentially dangerous was overwhelming. That's when Brenda Patterson made her grand entrance. She swept into the community center with 3 other HOA board members flanking her like bodyguards: Carol, the vice president, Steve, the treasurer, and Linda, the secretary. All of them had the same expression of barely concealed hostility. "What exactly is going on here?" Brenda demanded, her voice cutting through the nervous chatter. "This meeting wasn't authorized by the HOA board. You can't just use community facilities for unauthorized gatherings." "This is an emergency meeting for all residents," Howard said calmly. "We're discussing a serious safety issue affecting every home in this development." "You mean the wild conspiracy theory Mr. Owens has been spreading?" Brenda shot me a look of pure venom. "I warned you about causing panic in this community." "It's not a conspiracy theory," I said, holding up the environmental report. "We had professional testing done. This entire neighborhood is built on an active landfill. We all have dangerous levels of methane under our homes." "That's absurd," Carol chimed in, crossing her arms. "The developer assured us this land was perfectly safe. They wouldn't have gotten permits otherwise." "Then how do you explain the gas readings?" Martha asked, standing up from her chair. "My grandson is an environmental scientist. He's seen the data. This is real." "Your grandson is trying to drum up business for his consulting friends," Brenda snapped. "This is all a money-making scheme." The room erupted in arguments. Some residents sided with me and Martha. Others trusted the HOA board. A few just sat there looking shell-shocked. It was chaos until Howard raised his voice. "Everyone, please. We need to focus. The facts are clear. This development was built on a former municipal landfill without proper remediation or disclosure. That's illegal on multiple levels. We have grounds for a lawsuit against the developer, and possibly against the county for issuing permits without proper oversight. A lawsuit? Steve, the treasurer, looked horrified. Do you know what that would do to our property values? No one will want to buy here if this gets out. No one should want to buy here, I said, my voice rising. These houses are dangerous. We're literally sitting on top of explosive gas pockets. I won't allow you to destroy this community, Brenda said, her face flushed red. The HOA will fight this. We'll take legal action against anyone who spreads these lies and damages property values. Brenda, are you insane? Shouted a man named Thomas, who lived on the corner lot with his pregnant wife. My wife is having a baby in 3 months. You want us to stay in a house that could blow up because you're worried about property values. This is exactly the kind of hysteria I was talking about, Brenda said, but her voice wavered slightly. Everyone needs to calm down and think rationally. We are thinking rationally, Martha said. That's why we're scared. The meeting ended with the residents deeply divided. Howard advised everyone to get their own homes tested if they could afford it. He also started the process of filing a class action lawsuit against Greenfield Developments, the company that had built Meadowbrook Estates. The lawsuit alleged fraud, failure to disclose material facts, violation of environmental regulations, and negligent construction practices. Over the next 2 weeks, more residents got their homes tested. Every single test came back positive for dangerous methane levels. The local news got wind of the story, and suddenly, we had reporters camped out in the neighborhood, interviewing frightened homeowners and filming B-roll footage of our identical ranch houses. The county finally sent inspectors. They confirmed what we already knew. The landfill remediation done in the early 90s had been inadequate, and the developer should never have been granted permits to build residential housing on the site. The county building inspector who had approved the project had retired 3 years earlier, conveniently avoiding any immediate accountability. Greenfield Developments issued a statement denying any wrongdoing and claiming they had relied on county records that indicated the site was safe for development. They blamed the county. The county blamed the developer. And we homeowners were stuck in the middle, living in houses that were literally poisoning us. I moved back into my house despite the gas company's warnings because I couldn't afford to keep staying in the motel. I kept all my windows open, ran fans constantly, and bought 3 carbon monoxide and methane detectors that I placed throughout the house. I barely slept, waking up every few hours to check the detectors, terrified that I would see readings in the danger zone. The stress was destroying me. I lost 15 pounds in a month. I was constantly exhausted but couldn't sleep. My boss at the county assessor's office pulled me aside and asked if I was okay because my work performance was slipping. How could I explain that I was living in a house that might explode while watching my life savings evaporate? Then things got worse. Brenda and the HOA board started weaponizing the association bylaws against anyone who was cooperating with the lawsuit. Martha got a notice of violation because her lawn was 3 inches tall instead of 2.5. Thomas got fined because his trash cans were visible from the street for 27 minutes after pickup, when the rules stated they had to be stored within 25 minutes. I got cited for having a small crack in my driveway that needed immediate repair. The fine started small, $50 here, $75 there. But Brenda made it clear in her messages that they would escalate if we continued to damage the community's reputation with our lawsuit. This is harassment, Howard told me when I showed him the latest violation notice. The HOA board is retaliating against you for exercising your legal rights. That's illegal. Can we add them to the lawsuit? We can certainly make their lives difficult. Let me send them a cease and desist letter. If they continue this behavior, we'll file a separate action against the HOA for harassment and retaliation. The cease and desist letter only made Brenda angrier. She called an emergency HOA meeting, mandatory for all residents. I almost didn't go, but Howard advised me to attend and document everything. The community center was packed. Brenda stood at the front of the room behind a folding table, looking like a general about to address troops before battle. She had a stack of papers in front of her and that same fake smile plastered on her face. "Thank you all for coming," she began. "I know these past few weeks have been stressful for everyone. There's been a lot of negativity and fear-mongering in our community. I want to address that head-on tonight." "Fear-mongering," Martha interrupted. "Brenda, our houses are full of explosive gas," alleged explosive gas, Brenda corrected. "I've done my own research, and I've spoken with several experts who tell me that the methane levels described in these so-called independent reports are being blown out of proportion. Yes, there may be some natural gas seepage, but it's nowhere near as dangerous as certain people are claiming." "What experts?" I asked. "Who told you that?" "I'm not at liberty to share that information right now," Brenda said smoothly. "But trust me, I have it on good authority that this lawsuit is unnecessary and will only hurt all of us in the long run." "Show us the reports," Thomas demanded. "If you have expert opinions saying we're safe, show us the documentation." Brenda's smile tightened. "I don't have to show you anything. I'm the HOA president, and you need to trust that I'm acting in the best interests of this community." "The best interests?" I stood up, my voice shaking with anger. "You've been harassing us with bogus violation notices because we dared to point out that our homes are dangerous. You don't care about this community. You only care about protecting your own investment." "Sit down, Mr. Owens, or I'll have you removed from this meeting." "By who?" I looked around. "We're all just homeowners here, Brenda. You don't have any actual authority." That's when things got really ugly. Brenda's face turned red and she slammed her hand on the table. "I have every authority granted to me by the HOA bylaws. If you don't like it, you can leave this community." "We would leave if our houses weren't worthless," shouted a woman named Patricia who lived on the other side of the development. "No one will buy these properties now. We're trapped." The meeting dissolved into chaos. People were shouting, crying, arguing. Brenda tried to restore order but had completely lost control. Finally, Steve the treasurer stood up and said something that made everyone stop. "The HOA is broke," he said quietly. "We've spent almost all our reserves on legal fees trying to fight this lawsuit. If this keeps going, the association won't be able to maintain any of the common areas. We won't be able to pay for landscaping, pool maintenance, anything." "You spent our money fighting us." I was incredulous. "The HOA is supposed to represent all homeowners." "We're representing the homeowners who want to protect their property values," Carol said defensively, "not the ones trying to destroy them with lawsuits." "This is insane," Martha said. "You people are insane." I left that meeting knowing that we weren't just fighting the developer anymore. We were fighting our own HOA, which should have been on our side but instead had become another adversary. The next break in the case came from an unexpected source. A former employee of Greenfield Developments reached out to Howard with information she said would blow the case wide open. Her name was Hannah Cole, and she had been an administrative assistant at the company during the development of Meadowbrook Estates. Howard and I met with Hannah at a coffee shop in downtown Bakersfield. She was in her late 20s, nervous, constantly looking over her shoulder like she expected someone to be watching us. "I probably shouldn't be doing this," she said, stirring her latte without drinking it. I signed an NDA when I left the company, but I can't keep quiet anymore. People could die." "Tell us what you know," Howard said gently. Hannah took a deep breath. Greenfield knew about the landfill before they bought the land. They commissioned their own environmental study in 2019, before they broke ground. The study said the methane levels were too high for residential construction, without significant additional remediation work. But that remediation would have cost millions, which would have made the whole project unprofitable. My heart was pounding. So what did they do? They buried the report. Literally. The CEO at the time, Richard Greenfield, told us to shred all copies and never mention it again. Then they commissioned a second study from a different firm, a firm they had worked with before, and that they knew would give them the results they wanted. That second study downplayed the methane issue and said basic construction with standard foundations would be fine. "Do you have copies of the original report?" Howard asked. Hannah reached into her bag and pulled out a USB drive. "I kept digital copies of everything. I knew it was wrong, but I needed the job and I was scared to speak up. Then I saw the news stories about families living in these houses, about the methane levels, and I couldn't stay quiet anymore." Howard took the USB drive like it was made of gold. "Hannah, this is incredibly brave, but you're right that you could face legal consequences for violating your NDA. Are you prepared for that?" "I've already talked to my own lawyer," she said. "He thinks I have a whistleblower protection claim, and honestly, I don't care anymore. This is wrong. What they did is criminal." The documents Hannah provided were explosive. The original environmental study, from 2019, was comprehensive and damning. It clearly stated that the methane concentrations beneath the site were incompatible with residential development, without extensive remediation, including installation of gas ventilation systems, regular monitoring, and specialized foundation designs to prevent gas infiltration. The report estimated the proper remediation would cost between $8 and $12 million. The second report, commissioned just 3 months later, was a joke by comparison. It was shorter, less detailed, and concluded that minimal remediation efforts combined with standard construction practices would be sufficient. The company that produced it, Pacific Environmental Consultants, had been paid by Greenfield Developments on 4 previous projects. Howard immediately amended our lawsuit to include charges of fraud, intentional misrepresentation, and criminal negligence. He also provided copies of Hannah's documents to the district attorney's office, arguing that criminal charges should be filed against the executives at Greenfield Developments. The story exploded in the media. Local news turned into regional news, and then national news. CNN sent a reporter. The Los Angeles Times ran a front-page story. Suddenly, Meadowbrook Estates was famous for all the wrong reasons. Property values didn't just decline, they completely collapsed. Houses that had sold for $350,000 were now worth nothing. You couldn't give them away. What bank would issue a mortgage for a house built on an active landfill? What insurance company would provide coverage? The residents of Meadowbrook Estates became prisoners in our own homes. We couldn't sell. We couldn't refinance. We could barely afford to leave because we were stuck making mortgage payments on worthless properties. Some people just walked away, letting their houses go into foreclosure and destroying their credit. Others, like me, kept trying to fight. The strain on everyone was immense. Thomas's wife had their baby, a healthy girl, but they brought her home to a house filled with methane fumes. Martha ended up in the hospital with respiratory problems that doctors linked to prolonged gas exposure. A couple on the east side of the development got divorced. both of them blaming the stress of the situation for destroying their marriage. And through it all, Brenda Patterson continued to send violation notices. She cited people for weeds in their yards, for faded house numbers, for anything she could find. It was like she had become completely unhinged, unable to accept that her perfect little community was falling apart. Then, 6 months after I had first smelled rotten eggs in my living room, the FBI got involved. I was at work when I got the call from Howard. "Turn on the news," he said, excitement clear in his voice. "Right now." I pulled up a news stream on my computer and saw the headline: FBI raids developer's office in toxic housing scandal. The video showed federal agents carrying boxes out of Greenfield Development's headquarters in Fresno. Richard Greenfield, the CEO, was being led to a car in handcuffs. The charges were serious: wire fraud, mail fraud, conspiracy to commit fraud, and violation of federal environmental protection statutes. The FBI had apparently been investigating for months based on the information Hannah had provided and the documents Howard had submitted. They had found evidence that Greenfield Developments had knowingly defrauded buyers, lenders, and insurers by concealing the site's history and the environmental risks. I felt a surge of vindication, but it was tempered by the reality that Richard Greenfield being arrested didn't fix our houses. It didn't make them livable. It didn't restore our property values. It was justice, but it was hollow. The criminal case moved faster than the civil lawsuit. The federal prosecutors had an overwhelming amount of evidence. Richard Greenfield tried to fight the charges at first, but when 3 other executives agreed to testify against him in exchange for reduced sentences, he accepted a plea deal. He pleaded guilty to multiple counts of fraud and was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison. The other executives got lighter sentences, between 2 and 4 years. Greenfield Developments declared bankruptcy, which complicated our civil case because there were suddenly many creditors fighting over the company's limited remaining assets. But the criminal convictions gave us leverage. Howard negotiated with the bankruptcy trustee, the county government, and several insurance companies. It took another year of legal wrangling, but eventually we reached a settlement. Each homeowner in Meadowbrook Estates would receive full compensation for their home's purchase price, plus moving expenses and damages for emotional distress. The money would come from a combination of sources: the bankruptcy estate, insurance policies, and a settlement fund the county established to avoid a separate lawsuit over their negligent permitting process. In addition, the county agreed to properly remediate the entire site and help relocate all residents. They would buy out our mortgages, allowing us to leave without destroying our credit. It wasn't perfect. We all lost years of our lives to stress and fear. We lost our dreams of building equity and establishing ourselves in a community. But at least we wouldn't be financially destroyed. The Meadowbrook Estates development was eventually evacuated. All 45 families moved out over a 3-month period. The county demolished the houses and properly capped the landfill, installing the gas ventilation systems that should have been there all along. The land was eventually turned into a solar farm, which seemed like a fitting use for a site that had caused so much darkness in our lives. But there was still one piece of unfinished business: Brenda Patterson and the HOA board. Throughout the entire ordeal, Brenda had continued her harassment campaign. Even as the criminal case against Greenfield Developments was unfolding, she was still sending violation notices and trying to fine people. When the settlement was announced, she sent out a letter claiming that all homeowners would need to pay a special assessment to cover the HOA's legal expenses before they could leave. Howard had had enough. He filed a lawsuit against Brenda Patterson, Carol, Steve, and Linda personally, alleging harassment, retaliation, breach of fiduciary duty, and misuse of HOA funds. The lawsuit detailed every bogus violation notice, every threatening letter, and every attempt they had made to silence residents who were trying to expose the truth. We also filed complaints with the district attorney's office, arguing that the HOA board had engaged in criminal harassment and potentially extortion by trying to force residents to pay bogus fines and assessments. The district attorney's office took the case seriously. They interviewed dozens of residents, reviewed hundreds of pages of HOA correspondence, and examined the association's financial records. What they found was shocking even to those of us who had been on the receiving end of Brenda's behavior. The HOA board had spent over $200,000 in association funds fighting the lawsuit against Greenfield Developments, even though the HOA itself wasn't a party to that lawsuit. They had hired lawyers, paid for their own expert witnesses, and even paid for public relations consultants to try to discredit the residents who were suing. More damning, they had paid themselves. Brenda had given herself a salary of $30,000 for her work as HOA president, despite the bylaws clearly stating that board positions were volunteer roles. Carol, Steve, and Linda had also paid themselves smaller amounts. The district attorney charged all four of them with embezzlement and criminal harassment. The embezzlement charges were felonies because the amounts involved exceeded $25,000. The trial was almost anticlimactic after everything we had been through. The evidence was overwhelming. The defense tried to argue that the board members had genuinely believed they were acting in the community's best interests. But the prosecution showed email after email where they discussed using HOA funds to punish residents who were cooperating with the lawsuit. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours. Guilty on all counts, Brenda Patterson was sentenced to 3 years in state prison for embezzlement and criminal harassment. Carol got 2 years. Steve and Linda each got 18 months. All four were ordered to pay restitution to the HOA and to individual residents they had harassed. I attended the sentencing hearing. I wanted to see it with my own eyes. Brenda stood before the judge, her aggressive bob now streaked with gray, her face haggard and defeated. The judge didn't mince words. "You were entrusted with a position of responsibility in your community," the judge said. "Instead of helping your neighbors during a crisis, you exploited your position for personal gain and to settle petty grievances. Your actions caused immense suffering to people who were already suffering. I hope you use your time in prison to reflect on the harm you've caused." As Brenda was led away in handcuffs, I felt something I hadn't felt in almost 2 years: closure. I used my settlement money to buy a small condo in Fresno, about 45 minutes from Bakersfield. It was half the size of my house in Meadowbrook Estates and probably 20 years older, but it was built on solid ground. No landfills, no methane, no HOA. Martha moved to Sacramento to be closer to her daughter and grandchildren. Thomas and his wife bought a house in a quiet neighborhood on the other side of Bakersfield, with a big backyard for their daughter to play in. Hannah Cole became something of a celebrity in whistleblower circles, and now works for a nonprofit that advocates for stronger environmental protections. As for Meadowbrook Estates, it no longer exists except in news articles and legal documents. The solar farm that replaced it generates clean energy for thousands of homes, which feels like some kind of karmic balance. Sometimes I drive past the site, just to see it. The solar panels stretch across those 45 acres, glinting in the California sun. If you didn't know the history, You would never guess that 45 families once lived there, that their dreams had been built on top of a landfill, that they had been lied to and manipulated and betrayed by the very institutions that were supposed to protect them. I learned a lot from my time in Meadowbrook Estates. I learned that you should always research property history before you buy. I learned that developers don't always tell the truth and that government oversight isn't always reliable. I learned that even in the darkest situations, there are people like Martha and Hannah who will stand up for what's right. But most of all, I learned that the worst monsters aren't always the obvious villains like Richard Greenfield, who built houses on a toxic landfill for profit. Sometimes the worst monsters are people like Brenda Patterson, who had a choice to help their neighbors during a crisis, and instead chose to make everything worse for the sake of their own ego and control. The smell of rotten eggs that had first alerted me to the problem was long gone from my life, but the memory of it lingered. It was a reminder that sometimes the worst dangers are the ones you can't see, the ones hidden beneath the surface, waiting to be discovered. I still work at the county assessor's office, and I now pay special attention to the history of properties I'm reviewing. If I see anything in the records about former landfills or industrial sites, I flag it for extra scrutiny. It's a small thing, but maybe it will prevent another Meadowbrook Estates from happening. Life moved on as it always does. The story faded from the news cycle, replaced by newer scandals and fresher tragedies. But for those of us who lived through it, who spent years fighting for justice and struggling to survive in houses that were slowly poisoning us, the experience was permanently etched into our lives. I think about my wife sometimes, and I wonder what she would have made of the whole situation. She was always more pragmatic than me, better at seeing through people's facades. She probably would have spotted Brenda's true nature immediately and known not to trust the developer's glossy brochures. But she wasn't there, and I had to figure it all out on my own. The class action lawsuit was eventually studied by law schools as an example of environmental fraud and developer liability. The criminal case against Greenfield Developments led to stricter regulations in California about building on remediate landfills. The HOA embezzlement case prompted several counties to implement stronger oversight of homeowners associations. So maybe something good came out of all the suffering. Maybe the next family looking at a too-good-to-be-true housing development will do more research. Maybe the next developer will think twice before cutting corners on environmental remediation. Maybe the next HOA board will remember that they're supposed to serve their community, not rule over it. Or maybe not. Maybe people never learn, and the same mistakes will be made again and again. But at least for the 45 families who bought homes in Meadowbrook Estates, there was eventually justice. It came slowly and painfully, but it came. I'm sitting in my condo now, writing this all down so I don't forget the details. The air smells clean. My methane detectors have never gone off even once. When I wake up in the morning, I don't feel nauseous. It's such a simple thing, living in a safe home, but I'll never take it for granted again. Sometimes people ask me if I regret buying the house in Meadowbrook Estates, if I wish I could go back and make a different choice. The answer is complicated. Of course I wish I had known the truth before I bought. Of course I wish I had been spared the stress and fear and financial devastation. But going through that experience also taught me things about myself I wouldn't have learned otherwise. I learned that I was stronger than I thought, that I could stand up to intimidation and keep fighting even when everything seemed hopeless. I learned the importance of community, of people like Martha and Thomas and all the other residents who refused to be silenced. I learned that the system, while flawed and slow, can eventually deliver justice if you're persistent enough. The methane tests told the truth, but getting people to listen to that truth was the hardest part. Richard Greenfield didn't want to hear it because it threatened his profits. Brenda Patterson didn't want to hear it because it threatened her fantasy of a perfect community. The county officials didn't want to hear it because it exposed their failures. But the truth had a way of making itself known, seeping up through the foundations like the gas itself, impossible to ignore forever. In the end, that's what I hold on to. The truth might be buried, concealed, denied, and suppressed, but it's patient. It waits. And eventually, if enough people are willing to dig for it and fight for it, the truth emerges into the light. My name is Zachary Owens, and I bought a house built on an active landfill. I lost 2 years of my life to that mistake, along with most of my savings and a good portion of my sanity. But I survived. I fought back, and I won. The solar panels on that 45-acre plot in Bakersfield are still generating electricity, turning sunlight into power, transforming something toxic into something useful. I like to think that's what happened to all of us who lived through the Meadowbrook Estates disaster. We took something toxic and transformed it into purpose, into activism, into awareness. Not a day goes by that I don't think about that first morning when I smelled rotten eggs in my living room and knew something was wrong. If I had ignored it, if I had believed the realtor's explanation about new construction smell, who knows what might have happened? Maybe nothing. Maybe I would have lived there for years without incident, the methane levels never quite reaching the point of explosion. Or maybe one day I would have flipped a light switch and the whole house would have gone up in flames. I'm grateful I trusted my instincts. I'm grateful for Eddie, the gas company technician who took the threat seriously. I'm grateful for Martha and her grandson Daniel, and for Hannah Cole and Howard Brennan. I'm grateful for everyone who refused to accept the lies and kept pushing for the truth. The file boxes of documents from the lawsuit are still in my closet. Sometimes I think I should throw them away, that I should let go of that chapter of my life completely. But I keep them as a reminder that vigilance matters, that research matters, that questioning authority matters. That standing up to bullies, whether they're corrupt developers or petty HOA tyrants, matters. My condo is small and old and nowhere near as nice as my house in Meadowbrook Estates was supposed to be. But when I come home at the end of a long day, I can breathe easy. The air is clean. The ground beneath me is solid. And there's no HOA board threatening me with violation notices if I leave my trash cans out 27 minutes instead of 25. That might seem like a small victory, but to someone who has lived through what I lived through, it's everything. Peace of mind. Safety. Freedom from fear. These are the things that really matter, far more than granite countertops or an HOA-maintained pool. The story of Meadowbrook Estates is over now, at least for me. The houses are gone. The developer is in prison. The HOA board members are serving their sentences. The residents have all moved on to new homes, new lives, new chapters. But the lessons remain. Always question what you're told. Always do your own research. Always stand up for what's right, even when it's hard, even when people with power try to silence you. And never, ever trust someone whose primary concern is protecting property values over protecting people. The methane is still there, deep underground, slowly breaking down the garbage that was buried decades ago. But it's properly contained now, managed by people who know what they're doing, no longer a threat to families just trying to live their lives. Sometimes I imagine it as a metaphor for all the toxic things in life. They don't disappear just because you ignore them or cover them up. They need to be acknowledged, managed, and contained properly, or eventually they'll seep through whatever barriers you've built and poison everything around them. That's what Richard Greenfield never understood. That's what Brenda Patterson never understood. You can't build something good on a foundation of lies and neglect. Eventually, the truth comes out and everything collapses, but you can rebuild. You can start over on solid ground. You can take the lessons learned from your mistakes and make better choices. That's what I did. That's what all of us did. As I finish writing this, the sun is setting over Fresno, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. My condo might be small, but it has a west-facing window with a beautiful view. I never had that in Meadowbrook Estates, where all the houses faced the same direction in neat, uniform rows. There's freedom in chaos sometimes. There's beauty in imperfection. My new life isn't as neat and tidy as my old life was supposed to be, but it's real. It's honest. It's mine. And that's enough.